Hi, welcome to Studio Viv. I'm Viv, and today we are going to go over how I edit my photos. So quickly before anything else, you may be asking, why edit my photos in the first place? Can't my camera capture everything I need it to? Well, sort of. The camera is still a machine, and it will capture what it thinks looks good, which is more often than not at least a little different than what your eyes see. This is why you edit your photo, to create a photo that captures the scene the way you remembered it, or to stylize it to your liking. More than anything, it allows for more creative freedom. So now that we went over why we edit photos, because I'm a firm believer in learning by watching someone do what you want to learn, I'm going to show you my own photo editing process. And before we get started, remember that editing doesn't have a solid set of rules. It's more of a set of guidelines. It's a very creative and personal process, so don't at all feel obligated to do it how I do it. This is just how I would go about editing these photos. The first photo I'll be editing today is a picture I took of a tawny frogmouth bird. I edit all of my photos on Lightroom Mobile with my 2021 iPad Pro and the Apple Pencil. Link in the description for both of those if you're interested. But you can use whatever you're comfortable with for editing. It's not really a set in stone, oh, you have to use this or you have to use that. It's really whatever you're the most comfortable with. So now we are going to get into the editing. So now we're in Lightroom and we have the photo we're going to edit. I always start with the light and then I go down to the color and then the effects as they're placed in order in Lightroom, just because it makes it easier to kind of see what I'm doing. So first, what I want to do is I'm going to crop it so that this bird is in about the center of it. All right, there we go. Because if it's not, then you can't really tell what you're supposed to be looking at. So first of all, I always start with my exposure. I'm going to turn that up a little bit. Remember, a little goes a long way with exposure. And then it lightened the shadows, so I'm going to add some contrast and then decrease the highlights a little bit. And then one thing that I really like to do is I like to increase my shadows and then decrease the blacks. It makes those dark areas in your photo a lot richer. So that's one thing that's cool about editing on Lightroom on the iPad Pro is all you need to do to see your original image is you just hold the screen and then it takes you back to what you originally had. So I'm finding I would like to expose this a little more and then bring up the whites a little bit. Cool. So I'm also now realizing I want to move this over a little bit. Again, like I said earlier, you can always go back and change other stuff. So for now, I think I'm very happy with how the lighting looks. So I'm going to move on to my color. I'm finding, I think it's, as much as this is a very deserty looking thing, this bird is native to desert areas, it looks a little warm. Also looks a little green, so I'll go to my tint, increase the magenta, just a little bit. All right, so, and I want to increase the vibrance or the saturation. Vibrance is really good for when you already have a saturated picture, but it just needs a little bit of more color. And saturation is really good for when you have a very raw photo that doesn't have much saturation at all. Okay, so sometimes they can work well together, like I just did right here. All right. So I'm going to go into the HSL color mix and I'm going to take the oranges and then make them a little redder, a little brighter, and less saturated. Cool, I'm happy with that. See how much yellow there is. Take the yellow and saturate that a little more. Cool, I'm happy with the colors now. So now that I'm done with my colors, I'm going to go into my effects panel. So one thing I really want to emphasize is the texture of the bird's feathers. So I can do that by raising the texture. Leave that about there. Cool. See the difference? I like that, that looks good. So now I'm going to increase the clarity. I'm always very careful with my clarity because too much can make a very big difference. And then one way to increase the focus of your subject is to add just a little vignetting. You never want to do it too much. Here's an example of what not to do. That's something that you don't want to do unless you specifically want it to be a circle, because it looks like it's just too much. It looks like an awkward frame, sort of. So you really want to be careful with how you vignette it. I'm going to increase the roundness of it. All right, so now that I'm done with my effects, I'm going to go into my detail and increase the sharpness. Sharpening the image in Lightroom isn't really sharpening it, it's more adding digital sharpness. It surrounds each pixel with a lighter or darker pixel around it, which doesn't really make it any sharper, it just gives the illusion of sharpness. So that's something you do want to be careful with. I'm going to turn it up to 18, that's about right, and then turn up the masking. You always want to turn up the masking to just a little bit less than how sharp it is. All right, so doesn't need any lens correction. One thing I do want to do is with a mask, I really want to emphasize the color and brightness of this bird's eyes. So I'm going to select those specifically. This is easier with my Apple Pencil, but you can use whatever you want to. I'm going to expose it a little bit. All right, and saturate it. Cool. All right, so I think we're done with this photo. I'm really happy with how it turned out. We raised the exposure, we added contrast, we raised the shadows, and then lowered the blacks to add more contrast. We saturated it and added some vignetting for more focus on the subject, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. See how before it looks somewhat washed out, and now there's really some emphasis on the subject. So now we can move on to the next one. So now on the next photo, we have a butterfly that's very nicely perched on a leaf here. One thing that stands out about this photo is the subject is not directly in the middle of the photo. It doesn't always have to be right in the middle to add some interest to the photo. So right now I'm cropping it first, and the butterfly's wing kind of blends into the background. So first, as always, expose it. The highlights on the leaf I'm noticing are very bright, so I'm going to take the highlights down just a little bit, and then I'm going to raise the shadows so they're not so dark in the background, and then lower the blacks just a touch. The highlight there on the leaf is still pretty bright, so I'm going to add a mask and fill it in a little with my Apple Pencil, and then lower them so they're not too bright. I'm lowering the highlights on the leaf so that they don't guide the eyes away from the subject, which is the butterfly. So I think for now, unless I notice something later, I'm going to close the light tab and then move on to the color. So immediately I'm noticing it's a little green, so I'm going to turn up the magenta tint a little bit. It's also a little warm. So that looks good. I'm going to saturate it just a touch. Turn up the vibrance, also just a touch. Saturation can be kind of touchy, so again, like exposure, a little goes a long way. I really like this orange, but I'm gonna make it a little redder and a little lighter. So there's more pop and it adds more interest directly to the subject. Cool, so I'm happy with how the color looks right now. So I'm going to add, in the effects panel, I'm going to add some clarity, and I think that looks good. Again, a little goes a long way with clarity. And I think we are done with this photo. Some photos you will notice definitely need more or less than other ones. It really depends on what you're trying to convey with your photo. So this one didn't really need a lot, it just needed some exposure and some lessening of the highlights so that you can really see your subject. And I'm happy with this one, so now we can move on to the next photo. All right, so next is this cloud photo. So immediately what I'm seeing is that there's not a whole lot of contrast in this. So you might look at it and think, what am I gonna do with this? I might not edit it at all. But a lot of pictures can be fixed with editing. Not always, but a lot of the time. So there's not a whole lot of contrast in these clouds right now. So just raising the contrast on its own is going to take all the lightest parts and make them even lighter. So right now I'm not gonna touch the contrast. What I am gonna do is lower the shadows by a lot. So right now, and then I'm gonna add contrast. I'm gonna lower the highlights almost all the way because I don't want them to be too bright, but I'm gonna raise the whites so that the darks still stay as dark as I want them. So right now you're probably thinking, wow, this looks really yellow. So there are two ways we can go about this. We can either make the temperature more blue, but that kind of washes out our shadows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it black and white. I really like how that looks. It adds a good amount of contrast. You can see more of the edges of the cloud. And I really like all the edges, so I'm gonna add some texture and some clarity. And maybe a little vignetting. Another way you can edit your contrast and your exposure is through the curve. So I'm going to take the darks, and I really want to emphasize those edges. So I'm going to take that real low. Very nice. But I would like to lighten my lights. So there's the before, and now here's the after. You can really see how much the editing does for it. Before, it's still not a bad photo, but now there's more contrast and you can really see the volume of the cloud. And it's very visually interesting. It's very intriguing to me how much editing can do for a photo. You might think that it's totally not usable or it doesn't look good, but just changing a few things here and there can really change the entire thing. All right, so now that we've edited all three of those, we can see how much of a difference there is. There's the before for the first one, and then the after. Let's go over to the next one. There's the before, very dark, can't see much, and then there's the after where you can see most of what we want to see in the picture. And then the last one is the biggest difference. Very highlighted, washed out, can't see much, and then boom, tons of contrast, lots of visual intrigue. So now we know what all editing can do. All right, so I think we're done editing all of these photos. All right, so that's how I would go about editing these photos. I hope you were able to learn something new, and if you did, feel free to like the video. If you have any of your own tips, be sure to leave them in the comments, and if you like this video, you may like the rest of my channel, so feel free to subscribe. If you're interested in the iPad Pro and the Apple Pencil, there's a link in the description below, so you can go ahead and check it out. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and as always, go make some awesome content.